Once I was done with breakfast, I put on an audiobook and began the day by base coating the scenery. The brick wall itself was the surface which comprised most of the pieces, so I put on a bit of extra effort into it by texturing the bricks through some stippling using a sponge. To avoid clogging any recesses, I diluted the paint as I normally would before working some of it in and out of the sponge. Since this was a messy step, it had to be done before base coating the rest of the details, to avoid staining them and having to reapply the base coats. After going over all of the stonework, a second pass using an even lighter off-white color was applied. With the bricks ready, I base coated everything else, and these terrain kits by GW tend to have a lot of detail, but in the end they are just an accessory, which doesn't have to be overcomplicated and treated as a centerpiece. So I picked as little colors as I could for every other element, only picking 2 different wood tones on one of the pieces since the door was so eye-catching and I wanted it to stand out against the planks. With the base coats applied, I defined the recesses and created separation from one element to the other through the use of oil washes. I mixed some grey with a bit of black and a pinch of brown for the bricks, and afterwards plain brown for everything else. You can use whichever type of diluted paint you prefer, but I'm using oils for 2 reasons. First, budget-wise I'll be needing a substantial amount of wash for the 4 pieces of terrain, and mixing my own oil wash will be extremely cheap compared to having to go buy 1 or 2 pots of acrylic wash just for this project. Second, not only do oils have lower surface tension, which will make them flow into the recesses much better than regular washes, but once dry, any staining over the raised details can easily be cleaned off with the use of a Q-tip and a bit of solvent, of which I'll talk about more in a bit. Oils do however take some time to fully dry, but since I'm working with a diluted mix, a gentle blast with a blow dryer was enough to quickly evaporate the solvent and set everything in place so it all wouldn't run down and accumulate towards the bottom. As I did this, I made sure the pieces were flat and facing upwards. When it comes to the cleaning I was talking about, using the same solvent or white spirits I diluted my washes with, I'll snatch some up on a Q-tip, though making sure I don't have too much, and by gently rolling it over the surface I'll reactivate and pick up the paint from the raised details, sort of painting backwards. This would replace the highlight step in the common method of base coat, wash and highlight. If you'd like to learn all the ins and outs of oil washes, I recommend you watch my oil wash masterclass. Once the cleaning was done, I left the pieces outside under the sun for 2 hours, while I had lunch and took a break. Once I was back, the oils weren't completely cured but dry enough to work over them. And while I could call the piece done, my intention was that after giving the piece a standard wash, I'd tie up all the details together through my classic grim-dark mix of green, black and brown. I could have just done this wash and call it, but having previous layers of color adds to the complexity of the piece. You can see this in detail and explained in my recent grim-dark basic principles video. And I just want to mention that for this I used the exact same 18 ml tubes of oil I've been using since the creation of my channel almost 2 years ago, just to attest to the sheer value of oils. With the second wash applied, I did a repeat of the previous step, leaving the pieces outside to let it dry after a bit of cleaning while I had my afternoon coffee and relaxed. Last thing was to add some pigments, and just like with the washes, I know hobby products can be expensive, especially when scenery takes so much of it. So instead I'll use some ground up chalk pastels from before I got my hands on proper pigments, so to show you the results you can get using cheap alternatives to hobby products. This was as easy as brushing it on the bottom of the scenery with an old brush to make it look like dirt accumulated near the ground. I painted the details such as the fire and warp stones after dinner. You can find full videos on how to paint them in episodes 5 and 6 from this series, since I like to keep my videos as short as possible to not steal any more of your time. And with that, today's video comes to an end. I hope you found it both helpful and entertaining. Special thanks as always to my patrons who provide their extra support each month.